Welcome to The Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. As many of you know, I'm very pro immigration. I think we should have open borders. And I recently shared a post on Facebook. Michael Nyron originally posted it, but it was from a question and answer session involving Ayn Rand. And it was to get her view on immigration. And today's guest responded to it. He disagreed with me and disagreed. Well, we'll get to what he disagreed with. And I asked him to come on the show and he obliged me. So we're lucky to have him here. He is a professor in the business department he is a professor at New York City College of Technology, where he is also the director of procurement, and he is an emeritus professor at New York University. Professor Richard Aronin, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So before we get into the post, you have a clip that you wanted to share.
Okay. Basically, what I wanted to say, and this will connect a lot of this, is that I'm not against immigration.
Okay.
And when we discuss that, I want to be clear about that. My issue is with illegal immigration and with the methodology that we used for immigration.
Okay.
So that's the situation. The clip, and hopefully this is going to come up neat on your screen. Okay. The clip is from someone who you wouldn't have expected to say what he said, and it is from 2006. And I think it's a good place to start. So hopefully. Undetected, undocumented, and unchecked. Okay. I hope you could see that. That, of course, was Barack Obama before he was president, when he was still a senator in 2006. And I think I've always said he's a phenomenal speaker. I think he sort of put it very clearly, and that's the position that I would like to espouse, which is that we have to deal with it in a legal and vetted way, not eliminate immigration, but deal with it in a controlled way. And I think he mentioned a few of the issues that we'll bring up.
So the post was this. It was somebody asked Ayn Rand the question. This was the question. What is your attitude toward immigration? Doesn't open immigration have a negative effect on a country's standard of living? Miss Rand replied, you don't know my conception of self-interest. No one has the right to pursue his self-interest by law or by force, which is what you're suggesting. You want to forbid immigration on the grounds that it lowers your standard of living, which isn't true. Though if it were true, you'd still have no right to close the borders. You're not entitled to any self-interest that injures others, especially when you can't prove that open immigration affects your self-interest. You can't claim that anything others may do, for example, simply through competition, is against your self-interest. But above all, aren't you dropping a personal context? How could I advocate restricting immigration when I wouldn't be alive today if our borders had been closed? Now, here was your response to this. You are missing the key point by discussing a generalization. Rand believed in laws, just not in the welfare state. Immigration must be legal and vetted. Do you leave your home door open to all without vetting? We must also be concerned with our enemies that have no human morality as we understand it. Okay, so I'm a bit confused. Do you disagree with Rand's view, or do you think that I misrepresented her view?
If those are my two choices, I think I'll go with the second one.
Okay.
I think that Rand was talking about totally closing a border. I'm not in favor of totally closing a border because this country was built on immigration. My ancestors immigrated here as well. So I have no problem with leaving the border open as long as it's legal and vetted.
Okay.
And the reason for that is basically that immigration is a positive factor, provided it's under control. The same way I discussed keeping my door unlocked. Okay. I allow people into my house. I don't allow everybody into my house.
Okay.
So that's the analogy that I would like to bring, and we can discuss it in detail. Okay.
Okay.
But I just want to be clear about that because I don't want anyone to walk away with the professor says, close the borders and that's the end of it. And I
Next thing
don't
you know,
say that.
next thing you know, they're calling you Professor Xenophobe.
Yeah, well, they've called me many things over the
You don't
years,
want that.
and and I'm not. I
Okay.
have no problem with immigration as long
Okay.
as it's legal and vetted. And I think Rand, and I don't want to obviously put something in her mouth, and she's obviously not available to comment on that. But I think what she meant was fully closing the borders and not allowing
Okay.
anybody in. And I'm not in favor of that, and I don't think obviously she wasn't.
Well,
So
all I will say is that she said, how could I advocate restricting, not eliminating? So she said restricting, but I'm with you. She's no longer here. She can't speak for herself. So I'm going to defend my own view on
fair enough.
immigration because we could debate all day and we'll never really know exactly what she meant. So you said as long as it's legal, right?
Right.
So the Constitution of the United States is the highest law of the land, right?
It should be.
Absolutely. So where in the Constitution does it grant the federal government any authority at all to pass any restrictions on immigration unless it's from a country with which we are at war?
Okay. I'm not going to get deeply into a constitutional law issue because although I'm a professor, I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on television. Okay. I get into this particular issue with a lot of my students who ask me legal questions. Now,
Okay.
I'm familiar with it, but I'm certainly not the person to make a legal judgment on that. So I'm going to leave that question somewhat open because I don't feel qualified to make a legal constitutional judgment about where that immigration should be. I'll leave that to the constitutional lawyers. But what I'd like to discuss here is what makes sense and particularly business sense, because we talked about the benefits of immigration. And I think I'd like to discuss that. So if that works for you, we
Oh,
can go in that direction.
well, sure. But the problem I have is you said as long as it's legal.
Mhm.
Now, in my view, and I'm supported by somebody with as high a pedigree as James Madison, the
Mhm.
federal government has no authority to restrict immigration, which means that any laws restricting immigration would be unlawful. So if we're actually for the rule of law, we would have to be pro-immigration. So my question to you is this.
Well, I am pro-immigration. I
No, no,
didn't
no,
say
no,
I
no, no.
wasn't.
I'm saying no. I'm saying pro-open borders. Not the kind of. I'm saying that the
Okay.
Constitution offers no means for the federal government to pass laws restricting immigration unless we are at war with a country, which we don't have that issue certainly with Mexico. So let me put it to you
Well,
this way.
hold on. Let me, and you said that I could stop you because you have
Sure,
the same habit that I have that we could
sure.
just go on. I could do a 3-hour lecture without breathing. So I don't want to be rude, but I will
No,
stop
no. Go
you on
ahead.
that.
It's fine.
Let's talk about the border with Mexico.
Okay.
The border with Mexico is not just bringing Mexicans into the
Hmm.
United States.
Okay.
Right now, and I don't like the word open borders because it's such a charged word. Right now, with unguarded, appropriately borders,
Uh-huh.
okay, people are coming in from all over the world. Okay, many of them can be criminals, drug dealers,
Sure.
terrorists, etc. Okay, without again getting into the legal thing, because I don't think either, unless you have a legal degree, I certainly don't. I'm not going to get into a legal discussion about not only the Constitution, but laws that are passed. Because remember, without doing a legal lecture, okay, the Constitution is the start, and then laws have been passed well beyond the Constitution. Some of them were later declared unconstitutional. So, I mean, that's a question for the Supreme Court and lawyers and whatever. And as I said, I'm not going to get into that one. But in terms of a border that people can just come in without any restriction, that's a criminality issue. Right now, you have to have all kinds of ability to get into a building. Okay. You have to have ID. Are you suggesting that a building can't restrict people from getting into it? I mean, somewhere along the line, there's got to be a sort of a rational, not a legal issue, because I don't want to get into that, but a
Well,
rational issue of let me just finish this.
yep.
Where do you allow people to go without any restrictions?
Okay.
That's the question I'd like to start with.
So I'm gonna get to it, but I wanted this is important to me, this legality thing, because you specifically cited the law.
Mhm.
It has to be legal, and what I'm
Right.
saying is that by the Constitution, whether you believe it's practical or whether it's acceptable by
Well, there are all
law,
laws. Yeah, there
no,
are laws now about immigration. There's a
that are
process,
that are
etc. Now, if you're suggesting that all the laws about legal immigration are wrong and unconstitutional, that's a Supreme Court issue, and that's
okay.
outside what we're
Well,
going to talk about.
suppose this,
So,
and let me ask you this, and then I'll move on from this topic.
sure, no problem.
Being that you are in favor of the rule of law, if it could be demonstrated to you, and I understand you're not a lawyer, you don't have a law degree, but if you were convinced that the Constitution of the United States does not allow the federal government to pass any laws restricting immigration, would you then be in favor of a completely open border, other than in cases when we are at war with a country?
The answer to that is I really don't want to comment on it, but I'll try to give you a part of an answer. Okay. Unrestricted access is a fantasy. Okay. Like I said, with my house, with a building, you have to have IDs, you have to have otherwise you have criminality. Okay. Can someone walk into a bank and into the vault and steal the money because it's not in the Constitution? It's not just the Constitution, it's all the laws that are passed. Now, if your question is, you think the current immigration laws, and they are on the books, are unconstitutional, that's a totally different question, and that should go to the Supreme Court. And if you note, I mentioned to you, I'm in favor of a much more streamlined methodology for immigration. I think the process of legal immigration, which is now in law, codified, etc., beyond just the Constitution, okay, because there's a lot of laws that are beyond the Constitution, whether they're constitutional or not, is the Supreme Court's issue. Okay, I think it could be streamlined. I think the process of citizenship can be streamlined. Okay, not eliminated. I don't think anyone can walk into the country and say, hey, here I am, I'm a citizen. Okay. If that's your question, that I'm against.
Well, no. Well, the Constitution allows for laws pertaining to citizenship. It doesn't allow for the federal government to pass laws for immigration. Those are two different things. It allows for naturalization. But you brought up the issue of my home. You asked specifically in the Facebook post,
right,
would I leave my door open? The problem with the analogy is my home is private property. The border is not.
Excellent.
So if I own my home or I rent it from somebody who does, then it's within my rights to ban people from coming into my home.
So who owns the United States?
Do you know? Well, the problem with that question is it's not personal property.
No, it's basically the government has the ability and has used it many times, eminent domain and all kinds of things to show control and ownership of the property of the United States.
Yes.
Now, you also mentioned the idea of war. Well, are we at war at any particular time? Are there people out there trying to harm us? Are there terrorists? I mean, I won't go back to 9/11. I was in the middle of that. Okay. Clearly, there are people out there trying to harm us in a lot of ways. If we allow them unlimited access, okay, where are we?
Okay. Well, so first of all, there's a difference between government property and private property. I just want to make that
agreed
because the analogy. Okay,
we agree on that. But you brought up the difference between the private property of my house, and the government's property.
Yeah, and there's
the border is the government's property.
There's a big difference, right? And the government, but then you would go back to this, that the government is limited in what it can and cannot do by the Constitution. But you mentioned 9/11, for instance. But I think it was 18 out of the 19 terrorists were here on tourist visas. They weren't here as immigrants, and nobody out there is saying that we should get rid of tourist visas or limit tourism.
Well, wait a second. Where is that in the Constitution?
Where's what in the Constitution?
Tourist visas. Let me finish the thought. You brought up the question that if it's not in the Constitution, the government can't do it. There's
Listen,
nothing about tourist visas in the Constitution.
listen, I'm all for letting anybody come in that wants. What I'm saying to you is that to use 9/11 as an argument against immigration doesn't work because they weren't immigrants. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying I'm for tourist visas or I think the government
That
should be
wasn't the
passing them.
argument. I think you stitched two things
I did
together.
not. You said that.
Can I finish?
Well, you have to let me finish, Professor. I'm
Shoot, go
sorry,
ahead.
but you said that
All right.
people want to come here and do us harm. You specifically
Agreed.
referenced 9/11. And what I'm saying is that
excuse me. I use 9/11 as an example that there are people who want to do me harm.
sure.
I did not say those people were immigrants.
No. I'm not saying you said it. What I'm saying is that in the context of a discussion about immigration, when you bring up 9/11, which a lot of people do, the implication is that that is one of the reasons to have vetted immigration. But vetted immigration would not have prevented that.
No, better tourist visas might have.
That's not.
And other types of. Again, let me be clear. I bring up 9/11 as an example that there are people out there in the world who are looking to do us harm. They may not even be war situations, okay, without getting into all the different arguments about who they were and whatever, okay. The idea that the only time we should limit our borders is when we're at war, like World War II, et cetera, and that's got a whole bunch of issues too. We still have to limit our borders for crime, for terrorism, etc. Okay, we have to, even your tourist visas, you have to have some methodology for tracking and understanding who's coming into the country. Otherwise, we're just open for fresh pickings. That's like leaving, whether it's a private door or a public door, that's leaving the door open and expecting people not to steal and do crime.
So wouldn't that, well, there's a lot there that you just said.
Yeah, I know.
So wouldn't that apply though? I mean, from town to town, people just go from town to town. How can you stop criminals from leaving where I grew up in Wethersfield from going to Rocky Hill, or I'm in Connecticut? You can go from Connecticut to Massachusetts.
Wouldn't all those? No, that's totally different. And
how is it totally different?
I will tell you. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go too far. The Constitution talks about interstate versus federal. Okay. Basically, once they're in the country, and that's why you have to be concerned about getting them in the country. That's the door into the country. Once they're in the country, they can go from city to city, etc.
Based on what? The Constitution?
No, based upon logistics.
Well, hold on. Okay. But logistics is the same. I mean, borders are just artificial things drawn by governments or sovereignties.
No, borders
they don't exist in nature. They're not
in nature. No, that's totally different.
That's what I'm saying. You're saying logistics make it different, but first you referenced the Constitution. You said it deals with interstate transfers and interstate movement.
Right.
That's true, but you can't cite the Constitution and say it's different because it allows that. And then when I say yes, but it allows for open immigration, you say, well, I'm not an expert on the Constitution. I'm all for going by the Constitution, which allows both.
Okay. Let me be clear here. Okay. If you have a space, whether it's public or private, whether it's owned by an individual or it's in trust through the government. Remember, the government owns the United States as we the people having created the government, although sometimes I wonder about that. But basically, once someone is inside the border, okay, they have free access in the United States. In some countries, they don't. There are many countries where you have to have visas within the same country. But you mentioned tourist visas. A tourist visa allows you to cross our border. That's the first level of control. Okay. If we eliminated all tourist visas and we eliminated the border, anybody could go into the country. And once they're in the country, it's even easier to go from city to city, state to state. Sure. All I'm saying is that the control, whether it's for crime, terrorism, war, whatever the purpose is, the control has to be at the border. And we are not the only country that has borders. In fact, our borders are much more porous than many other borders. There are countries currently and historically that shot you if you tried to leave the border. Okay. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting we're doing that right away. Okay. All I'm suggesting is that at the border, if someone is coming into the border, whether or not they're a citizen, if you leave, you have to come back and you have to go through customs. Okay. Are you suggesting customs should disappear also? I mean, if you're saying open borders, what's the difference between somebody coming in from another country and having no checkpoint and somebody literally leaving and coming back and not going through customs?
Listen, I'm for freedom. I'm not opposed to people leaving, coming, going, whatever.
So
And
you would eliminate customs of any
well,
sort.
I
There would be
to
no
be
checkpoint at
well,
all.
to be perfectly honest, I haven't given that particular subject a lot of thought. So
But it's
I'm not.
connected. But
Well,
it's
it
I
is.
don't mean to. I don't
No,
mean
it
to.
was
I don't
sure.
mean to
I'm
push
not
it.
saying it's not, but ultimately, if by customs you're talking about searching people before they come in, my inclination is to say I'd get rid of it. But
Totally.
I'm not saying that I couldn't be convinced otherwise about that specific
Well,
thing.
we have a debate down the line because that'll be a beautiful debate.
Sure. So
Because if you don't do any kind of customs, even with people going in and whatever, any number of things, whether they're nuclear weapons, whether they're
sure,
biological weapons, whether there's pests, whether they're invasive species, there's a
Professor,
staggering amount of things.
life entails risk.
Of course.
And so the bottom line is, would I rather have freedom with the risk or have a government that's able to detain people and lock them up for trying to cross a border? I'm taking freedom with risk. There's risk both ways. The main reason I told you, before we,
Right.
when I contacted you earlier, I told you there's the
Right.
two main reasons I am for open borders are the Constitution, because the Constitution does not allow the federal government to restrict immigration. But the
It
main
doesn't stop
reason,
it. It does no, but without getting into the legal, it does not say it cannot. It just doesn't deal with it. It's dealt with in law afterwards.
well, the Constitution is a power granting document. Article 1,
Yes.
Section 8 specifically grants Congress the delegated authority that it has. If it's not there, it doesn't have it, because
Right.
then you can go to
And we know that Congress has never gone beyond its authority.
no, they
I'm
usurp
just
it.
gonna
That
leave that
doesn't
in.
make it
Okay.
right. That doesn't
I
make
didn't
it
say it was, but I
lawful.
just wanted to,
But
I
that's
just
what
wanted to
we're
get
no,
that
but that's what
caveat.
we're ultimately talking about. Of course they do,
Okay.
but by that logic, you can say, well, I could say, well, it's unconstitutional for federal agents to beat you in the street, so they couldn't do it. Well, they go beyond their authority. Of course they do.
Sure.
But the individual rights argument is my main
Mhm.
reason for supporting open borders. There's two dynamics to this, right? The
Right.
one is the right of mobility, the right of people to go wherever they want, as long as they aren't violating the private property rights of others. That's one. But two, so that would apply to your immigrants. But two, it's the individual rights of American citizens. Like you said before, I own a home. If
Mhm.
I want to let somebody from another country into my home, who is the government to stop me? Don't I have a right to have in my home who I want? What if I'm an employer? Why don't I have the right to hire whomever I want? Why is the
And let
government
me,
telling me? And the
you're
government is
absolutely right.
the
You're
government's interfering with my
absolutely,
rights.
yeah, you're absolutely right in terms of what you're saying in terms of the rights. The question now becomes, where do you put control, law enforcement, um, dealing with terrorism, criminals, drugs, etc. I mean, basically, if we had, let's go with what you said. Let's open the borders. Let's have no visas. Let's have no customs. So
Sure.
anybody comes and goes.
Yeah.
How do you deal with drug trafficking? You can't.
Well,
As bad as this, wait, let me
how would
finish.
I?
I let you finish. Let
No,
me
no, you go
finish.
ahead. I just want to know
Okay.
if you're asking how
I,
I would deal with it.
well, anybody. I mean,
Okay.
I don't mean to you. I just use that as a debating tool. Okay. But how would anybody deal with the idea of drug trafficking? Right now, we have a tremendous, I'm just using this as one example. We have a tremendous drug traffic issue and we have some control. Now, if we eliminated all that, the amount of drugs that would flood into this country would be unbelievable. We then have issues of terrorists and people coming in from outside the country to harm us, whether they're on visas or whatever. Okay. If we open everything up and we have no control, it will be worse. Okay. That's where the 9/11 analysis comes in. Okay. Uh, I just cannot see a country surviving without a border. It's not a country then.
Well,
It's
there would
just
still be
open
a
space.
hold on. There would still be
Where
a
would
border. There's still a border because there's laws within that border. The sovereignty of the United States, there's still laws in there. For instance, you can't rob people, you can't shoot people, you can't stab people. There's all types of things. There's the right to freedom of trade, freedom of mobility within the country, like you said. All that would still apply. It just wouldn't stop people
well,
from
no,
coming in.
it would. No, okay.
Wait, so we couldn't pass
Problem
laws
is,
within the country because there's an open border?
no,
That doesn't make any
the laws would
sense.
be used. No, no,
Why would
no.
they be useless?
You're,
So a law against
you're
murder.
mixing two
Hold on.
things.
So hold on. So a
Okay.
law
So
against
let's
murder.
talk about murder. Okay.
Okay, murder, theft, robbery, rape, interstate sex trafficking, whatever you want.
One at a time.
Those laws would be inapplicable if the southern
No,
border.
I didn't say they'd be inapplicable. They would be hard to enforce. If people could come and go in and out of the country, they could murder and run away out of the country. They could get in and out, okay, without any control. You would increase your murders, as we know. If you have drug situations, if you have other issues, okay, if people are coming to this country and there's absolutely no way of vetting or controlling who those people are or doing back check, etc., the visas, etc., whether it's immigration or temporary or whatever, you're going to have a tremendous problem. You will lose sovereignty of the country because you will have no control over it.
So
it's already starting now,
well,
but it will be dramatically worse.
But immigrants have lower crime rates than native-born citizens.
Okay, let's stay away from the issue of immigrants. We're talking about anybody walking into the border.
We're talking about anybody.
I'm going to agree with you that most of the people who immigrated into this country are good people.
And some are criminals, and some are going to be anyways. But it still wouldn't stop. Even if you had open borders, it still wouldn't stop the federal government from knowing who came into the country.
How would they know?
Because you could have a system where when somebody comes in, they go through a checkpoint and says, "This is who I am."
That's exactly what I'm saying.
But you're still allowed to come in. You're still allowed to freely.
No, you are allowed to come in.
They're not stopping you. That's what a visa is. I understand that that's what it is. I'm telling you how I think it should be. Like you put out there, for instance, you said, well, then drugs would be flowing through. I would get rid of the war on drugs. Then you wouldn't have that issue. That's my whole point is I'm advocating.
So you would get rid of all the laws against drugs and the drugs would disappear.
No, the drugs wouldn't disappear, but the need to traffic them by cartels in the black market would certainly disappear.
So certainly. What about the number of people who die from all those drugs? Well, those numbers have gone up. Now, some of it has to do with the
numbers
cartels.
Would drop.
I agree with you.
Those numbers would drop precipitously. I do, because now
we definitely have a debate on whether eliminating all laws of drugs would help people or not.
Well, I'm not helping them is not what I'm talking about. You asked specifically about deaths. And what I'm saying to you is right now, I used to be.
Let's take fentanyl as a good example.
Sure.
Okay. Staggering amounts of fentanyl are pumped into this country.
Yes.
If they were not pumped into this country, people wouldn't be dying at the level that they are.
And suppose the drugs you were buying were legal. Suppose the drugs you're buying are legal. Suppose you're going to buy heroin.
People die from fentanyl that's legal too.
People die normally and usually. I'm not saying it never happens. People usually die from fentanyl overdoses because they're using drugs that are laced with fentanyl and they have no way of knowing how much fentanyl is in those drugs. If the drugs are legal, then
that is true, but not 100% of the
No, there's nothing's 100%. People are going to, but they're dying now while it's illegal. What I said is
because we're not doing much of a job. We're allowing tons of it.
Wait a second. How many people are in prison in the United States of America because of drug offenses? What do you mean we're not doing anything? Of course, they lock people up for this. I was in jail for 25 years. You think I didn't see people in jail for drugs? Of course. There's plenty of people in jail for drugs.
No, I understand that, but let me ask you a question.
Sure.
We've had the war on drugs in some different form for more than your 25 years. Have we been terribly successful?
No.
Okay, so clearly we're not doing the right thing.
No, and all they do is infringe on the freedoms and rights of Americans. That's all they do. They haven't solved the problem.
and traffic more drugs.
If not just that, but they can raid your home. How many times do they mistake the home they're going in, or they go in a home they don't find anything? They violate your Fourth Amendment rights.
That's a whole different. But that's not an immigration issue. That's totally different. And I would probably agree with some of that.
Yeah, no, but you asked what would I do about the drug thing. That's what. So I'm answering it. That's how I personally would solve it. I would get rid of those stupid laws. I'm for individual rights. That's why I would do it. So that's why I would open the border.
Basically, you would eliminate. Basically, if you're for individual rights, you eliminate all law enforcement.
No, not at all.
Why not?
You uphold laws that protect individual rights. I mean, this is not something revolutionary that I'm talking about here. I'm going back to Locke. The purpose of government is to protect the life, liberty, and property of the citizenry.
And that's exactly what a border is part of doing.
Well, hold on a second. How
I
does
mean,
it,
if you're
how
going to
does, hold
argue
on.
Locke versus the Constitution,
Hold on. How is restricting the mobility of foreigners and preventing American citizens from dealing with them protecting liberties? How is that protecting
very
property?
simple, very simple.
How?
I'll be glad to give you an answer.
Okay, you give me
Okay.
an answer.
Yeah, I'll be glad to give you an answer. Okay. Let us make a couple of assumptions just so that we can get this argument
Okay.
moving along. Most of the people who are coming in on immigration are good people and don't have harm. Fine.
Sure.
A certain percentage, X, I'm not even going to talk about a percentage, do have harm. They are either dealing drugs, they are murderers, they are looking for whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So there's it. Now, if you allow the borders to be totally open, the number of people this group of X comes through and we have no control over them and we have no way of stopping them.
Okay.
No country in the world allows literally just open borders and anybody can walk in without, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, hold on. For the majority of the countries, for the first, I mean, till 18, I think 1875, I want to say.
I remember it well, by the way.
Yeah. Is that when you first came over here?
Yeah, that was my students, whatever. They go, yeah, I remember it very well.
Or was it the Mayflower?
Yes, it was the Mayflower, right.
But for the majority of the country's history, we had open borders.
When you say open borders,
I'm saying they didn't prevent people from coming in. They didn't tell people, no, you cannot come into the country. But then, I mean, with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1870s, and I think in the 1920s, they really revamped the immigration laws. But for most of the
because
country's
the world has changed. The world, I mean, basically, you can't compare the world of the 1800s and the world of today. Okay, the ability to do damage. Let's go after one thing. The ability to do damage is so much more accentuated today. Okay. Back then, there was a limited damage that one person can do. Today, there's almost no limited damage. Okay. An individual can do a tremendous amount of damage. Okay.
Sure.
Because they've got technology, they have all kinds of weapons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the risk, to use your earlier, I'm not even going to, Grace would say, I agree with it, but your risk management assessment, basically the risks are much higher today than they were in the 1800s. So there's more of a need to control and to understand. Now, I said from the beginning, and I'm going to go back to that I don't think we should eliminate immigration. Never said that.
No.
I just said that we should vet people. Now,
yes,
the disagreement that we have is, I'm assuming that you have no problem with vetting people, whether it's a visa or a customs or whatever it is, some type of control. Okay. Now, whether the government does it right or not, or well, that's a whole different question. But the idea of totally eliminating any control about people coming into the country, I think is a terrible risk.
Okay. I want to note something. My argument for this, and this is the point, is constitutional and rights based. So right. Even if, for instance, immigrants were coming into this country and competing for jobs and people were becoming unemployed, some Americans.
I don't have a problem with that.
No, I don't either. But what I'm saying is that it would not be my primary issue.
Right.
My primary defense is one of individual rights. But you cannot, when you get into a utilitarian assessment like you just did, well, the risk, they're coming here, this and that. You cannot just focus on one side of the ledger and say, what about the risk of the people coming in? Well, what about the cost right now in keeping them out? What about the cost to upholding border security, upholding ICE? How much waste, fraud, and abuse is involved there? How many people that are trying to come here that are not criminals and are not terrorists are being detained? And then there's this. How many immigrants that would come here or that are being prevented would come here and add value to the country? Maybe in terms of inventions, maybe in joining our depleted military.
I'm not going to disagree with that. All I'm going to say, I'm not disagreeing with that. Okay. Like I said, I have no problem with eliminating desire to eliminate immigration. But what about the people who are going to come here causing harm?
Well,
Okay.
the question is it outweighed by those that are going to come here doing good?
That's a huge part of the question.
Well,
And
I would argue yes.
that's the reason I lock my door and I let some people in and not others.
But you could
And
still lock your door even if there's open immigration. You can still protect your private property and your
but I
person.
can't protect myself if I'm on the subway or walking around and there are people who are here to do harm that wouldn't have been here if they were vetted.
I don't think, I got to tell you,
You're
that
increasing.
that the immigrants coming in are looking for Professor Rich to do them harm. I just don't think. I mean, you're too
I
nice
hope
of a
not. No, no, no.
guy.
And yeah, no, I appreciate that. But I'm not talking about myself. I use myself as an
I know. I
example,
was
but
teasing you. I
it's
got you.
okay.
And I'm not saying there's no risk in what you're talking about. What I'm saying is that in the United States of America, a country that was founded to be a different country, a different type of country, a
And we
free
are.
country.
And we are
Sure. Yeah.
compared to, I mean, compared to many countries. I mean, I can give you an argument about, capitalism, socialism, US, Soviet Union,
Yes, but
CCP,
freedom
the
is
whole
a
bit.
value. So
Agreed.
there should be, in my view, a presumption of liberty, a presumption of
There
upholding and
is.
defending rights. So in a case where you have a utilitarian calculus like you just gave, where you have the risk of immigrants coming in, but then there's also the benefit that they're going to do, we can't figure out, ex ante, what is going to occur. Is there going to be greater risk, greater benefit? The historical evidence would
But I
suggest
don't
to
think
me that
that's the, I don't think that's
no,
the
no,
argument.
but there's the historical evidence suggests that immigrants are a greater benefit than a threat, right? We
I
can't
don't think
know.
that's a problem.
No,
I'm willing to go ahead and even agree to that the large majority of immigrants are a benefit. I'm just concerned about the degree of people, let's stay away from immigrants. They're people walking over the border. They're not necessarily immigrants. They may be here for any number of reasons.
sure.
That's the problem. We don't know that they're here to immigrate and do wonderful things, etc. I have no problem with that, and I agree that we should improve the methodologies. Okay, that I agree with 100%. Okay, but the question becomes, how do we deal with the issues in terms of protecting the society? You mentioned Locke, etc. Okay, how do we deal with protecting the rights of the individuals from being harmed? Now, you can't tell me that allowing anybody into the country is not going to add to the risks and the harm. People are killed, people are raped, drugs. They could even come in with a nuclear weapon. They could come in, my God, with a biological weapon. Okay,
Yeah.
I
Well,
won't even get into that whole
first
issue.
of all, that can happen now. Secondly,
Of
that's
course it can,
you
but
make
you're making it much easier.
what I'm well. Yes and no. Yes, it might be easier for somebody to come, but also, yes, with the benefits of having more immigrants here, we would have a stronger military and we would have a better populace. We would have more people employed, probably more police officers, because now we've got a bigger population and more people that be willing to join. So that those risks could easily be offset by the benefits.
No, I'm not going to argue with you that the benefits of immigration are substantial.
Okay.
Like I said, that argument I'm not going to even
so
argue
then the
with.
question is, do they offset the risks? That's the question. You can't bring up the risks and then
the benefits of the risk are to different people in different situations. Let me ask you a question, because I think we're missing a point. You're sort of dancing around this.
I don't think so. I think I'm pretty direct.
Okay, if the benefit, well, let me finish my statement and then we can disagree with it. Okay, if the benefit is to 10 people over there for a particular action, but it kills me, but it's 10-1, is that acceptable? Where do we draw that line?
Well, what if I reframe that question? Because there might be a risk, there's a risk. We don't know specifically to some people. Does that justify violating the rights of a whole lot of people? Well, they're not violating. Of course you are. Hold on, but I've already made the case. First of all, you're violating the Constitution. That's point one. Second point,
like I said, I'm not going to get into that whole thing.
But that's part of the equation that you're just eliminating and say, but that's a huge part of it. But then the individual rights. But what about the individual rights of the American citizens to deal with whom they want and the right to mobility of immigrants?
Let me talk
about.
You are
stopping it. You are stopping it. You're stopping it because there's a risk.
You're vetting it because it needs to be vetted. I mean, the same way you go through are you suggesting, let's bring this down from the sort of very high philosophical, I have the right to do anything, where
No
do
one
we,
ever
where
said
do we,
that. That's not what I said. I never said people have the right to do anything. I never
well,
even
where do
came
you
close to
draw,
say
where
that.
do you draw the line for
I
your
draw the
rights?
line where they're violating the rights of others.
Right. And that's
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 where.
my concern. My
But
concern
somebody
is,
merely crossing the border doesn't violate anybody's rights. Preventing them from crossing does.
but you're not preventing them. You're vetting them. There's a difference.
Well, what? Hold on a second.
You are vetted to walk into a building. Even if it's a public, for instance, you argued about private space. You said my house is different because it's my house. I own it. Okay.
Yes.
But if you're walking into a government building, okay, you're vetted as well. Look
Sure.
at the whole January 6th argument. Okay, I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but the argument was these people were not allowed in a government building.
Sure.
Well, where do you draw the line? The answer is the country is the same situation. The country is the larger part of our containment.
Well,
Okay,
it's
we
not a
have
physical
building.
structure, so it does differ in that.
Well, if you had walls, it would be physical, but it doesn't have to be physical.
No, I get your
It
meaning.
doesn't have to be
But
physical.
if all you're saying, let me just ask you, is all that you're saying is that if somebody if you come to the border and you're trying to come in, they run a quick check on you. They run a check.
Right.
And
Right.
if they determine you're not a terrorist,
or whatever the issues are, let's leave that open, because getting into the specifics of how you do the check is a different question.
well, but
Let's
here's the
say-
problem.
Right.
You're gonna say, suppose that somebody wants to come here from Paraguay, right?
Okay.
And you run a check on them and you discover, well, they were committing felonies in Paraguay.
Right.
But we think that according to American standards, the type of things they were doing shouldn't even have been against the law.
Wow. Now that's a whole different issue.
Well, but that's the type of problem you're going to have with this system of vetting that you're talking
Absolutely.
about. So
Absolutely.
what you do
you're also
is you
going to
let
have
people come in and
you're
you
also-
enforce American laws once
No,
they're
what you're
here.
doing is you let people come in and then you respond after they do the problem.
Yes.
Whatever the problem is. Well, that's not acceptable.
Well, that's what we do. That's what we do when people move from Florida to California.
Well, why do
Massachusetts
we
to
allow?
Delaware?
Okay, let me ask you something. Why do we stop people from going into a building? Even I'll stay away from the private issues, but that's a separate.
Well,
public building. Why don't we let them go into every public building, and after they blow it up, then we'll worry about it.
Well, there's a couple things here. First of all, if you're talking about a private building, then it's up to the private property owner. If you're talking about a government building, it's a different scenario and it's a different argument. And the argument could be made to allow people to go in. The problem is, by definition, that building is restricted in how many people it can fit. So that might be an issue.
Is that the only issue?
No.
I
I'm
think
not
that's
saying
a
it's the
small
only. I'm
issue.
not saying it's
That's a
only.
very
I'm
small
saying
issue.
it's an issue.
Why do you have magnetic detectors or metal detectors or a pat down or a ID check or whatever when you're going in anywhere? Because
Well,
you need to
hold
have
on. It's not
some
when you're
type of
going in
vetting.
anywhere. That's not true. It's not when you're going in anywhere. I went into McDonald's this morning. There was no metal detector. There was nothing. A month or so ago, I went to a wrestling event at a civic center. There was no
McDonald's. Excuse me.
was a metal
McDonald's
detector,
is McDonald's is a private owned
Sure.
establishment. They make their rules. We've
Yes.
established that. I
Yes.
make my rules. My rule is you don't come into my house unless I let you.
Yeah.
McDonald's rule is you're going to buy that
Yes.
junk. I mean that food, and they let everybody in.
That's
But
his
if you
opinion,
go
people,
into-
not mine. Don't sue me because of his take on McDonald's.
Oh, okay. I apologize for McDonald's. It's there. I didn't say anything unreasonable about it. I said they made a decision to let people in without.
No,
any
you
kind
said
of
it was
vetting.
junk food.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. It's fast food.
It's
Let me
fast,
correct
yes.
that. Let me correct
Okay.
that. I apologize. I meant fast food. Its
Yes.
quality is a whole different
Let me
issue.
just say off the bat, I'm not disagreeing with you, Professor, that there's risk entailed in open borders. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm
Well,
saying is
that's a fact. You can't
if-
disagree that it's
but
a
of
fact.
course, but there's a risk. Like I said, when I walked into McDonald's this morning, there's a risk.
Sure.
Anything you do in life entails risk. The
Right.
question to me is, are we going to live in a country that abides by the Constitution and upholds the individual rights of its citizens and the individual rights of others? Because foreigners are human beings also. They have rights as well.
Well, now wait a second. The Constitution doesn't cover the foreigners. The Constitution covers the United
According to
States
James
citizens.
Madison, it does.
Okay.
And I'm going to take
Would you
James
bring him?
Madison's.
Would you bring him to the next conference?
I wish I could. I mean, I think if people would just read the report of 1800 and pay attention to what the man says, maybe read the Constitutional Convention debates,
Again, I'm not going to get into the legal issue because
No,
we're now slipping into
we're not slipping
very,
anywhere.
well, we're
No, no,
slipping.
we're not. We're
Well,
really not.
okay, we're
You brought
sliding
up from
into,
the
we're
get-go.
moving
Hold on.
into,
How can you bring up from the get-go? It has to be legal. And then when I cite the supreme law of the land, say, oh, no, we're not going to get into legal. You said as long as it's legal. That was your point from the
that was
get-go.
one of the 2 points. Yes, absolutely. But didn't come on here to discuss legality. As I said, I don't feel qualified. Maybe you do. I don't know if you have a law degree or not. I mean,
Well, I
whatever.
don't know. I have general reading comprehension, and I
That's
have
good.
read
So do
quite a bit on the
I.
subject.
So do I. But
And to be fair, I
it,
have interviewed constitutional experts on this particular subject.
that's fine. And
Maybe
if you
one
want to
was your
bring,
colleague. I don't know. You were at NYU. Were you there when Richard Epstein was there?
I think I met him once, in a
Yeah,
big,
he's great.
yeah. And
He's
there are
great.
lots of, and if he were coming up with a legal opinion, that would be different than my legal opinion. I'm not going to get drawn into a legal opinion, whether it's James Madison or the Constitution or whatever, because basically one of the things you're saying is
So you can
if it's
bring up
not in a,
Barack Obama, but not James Madison?
well, Barack Obama didn't say legal.
No,
None of
Barack
his
Obama
comments.
made a case. You said, look at this. I got this clip. Barack Obama.
Well, I thought it was an interesting clip,
It was
particularly because,
it demonstrates his
particularly be,
hypocrisy. I'll give you that much.
well, I'm not going to get into that. I certainly don't want to say that because I'll get all kinds of people yelling at me because I said he was a hypocrite, but I didn't. You did.
I definitely did.
Okay. But basically, he certainly was a person who had a comment level.
Sure.
Okay, I don't want to get into it. It's above his pay grade, but he was the president at one point. He was a senator at one point, and his comments about the border are part of the situation. He's also traditionally been on the party that tends to be for open borders. So the fact is, and that's the reason I brought up that 16-second clip, that here's somebody who's been, I guess I can call him a leader of the party that's been in favor of open borders. Okay. And yet, when it was appropriate for him to say it, he said, we have issues to deal with. And I agree with him. I don't agree with him necessarily all the time, but I agreed with him in this particular clip. So that's why I brought the clip up. I thought it was an interesting thing to start with.
All
but
right.
he did not mention any legal issues.
No, he did not. And he's not somebody I trust on the Constitution anyway. So I have one more question.
Well, he was president. He gets some credit on something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I mean, he's a constitutional professor.
Yeah, no. Well, supposedly, I'm going to
Yeah.
leave that alone.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other issue is that basically he had a tremendous effect for 8 years on the borders. Okay, you can't disagree with that. And
No.
his, what would we call Joe Biden? His vice president. That's a fair statement at one time, who has now become, whatever you want to call him in the White House. Certainly, I mean, basically you've got the entire other side of the coin talking about open borders, and yet their leader, okay, and I guess you got to call him a leader in some form, at one point said, we shouldn't have open borders because there are problems. That's why I brought it up. It was a 16-second clip. So
okay. So before coming on today, you mentioned on Facebook that this would be like a Lincoln Douglas debate. So this is a very vital question that you answer now.
Okay.
Who's Lincoln and who's Douglas?
Wow. I don't know. What do you think?
I got a little bit of a beard. It's not quite the Lincoln beard, but to be fair, I don't know what Douglas looked like. I just know that they had a lot of debates. I think they had 7.
Well, I use the Lincoln Douglas concept, not so much that I was making you or I Lincoln or Douglas, but that it is probably one of the most famous debates in American history. So I have a tendency, and you can argue it, to look at one point of something, not necessarily everything, because finding an example that covers everything is much more difficult. Finding an example that identifies a particular point, like the fact that the Lincoln Douglas debate are still remembered. I mean, there are plenty of debates since
as
then,
will this one, by the way.
I don't know, but that would be nice. And I look forward, by the way, and I'll throw this out, to discussing. There must be a half a dozen things that you and I have already identified that we have different opinions on.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting too.
In my mind, I've already got you coming back on. Don't you worry.
No problem.
Now, if you don't consent, well, then I might have to violate my own principles and violate your rights and have you dragged
Well,
in here
I don't
and
know.
question me.
That I think I would have a problem with, but you won't have that problem because I love to talk and I love to debate. But
So don't
and
I.
I do, and by the way, I do agree with you that individual rights are crucial. And that's my concern, is that the individual rights of the citizens that form the society of the United States are paramount. And that's a first step. If the government does not protect its citizens, what the hell do we need a government for? That's why there's a military. That's why there's a legal system to protect the citizens. Now, do I think other people that are not citizens have? Absolutely. But I'm just saying the first primary goal of a government is to protect its citizens. If it doesn't do that, what the hell do we need it for?
Well, I think we can agree on that. It's a good place to stop. But I want to ask you before I let you
Yep.
go,
Yep.
have I treated you fairly? Did I leave anything out? Do you have anything
Oh,
else
no,
you want
no,
to
no
say?
problem. No problem. In fact, I think that we are, to get back to the Lincoln Douglas issue, I think we are fairly evenly matched. We have slightly different strengths and weaknesses, and I think it comes across well. And I'm not going to sit there and study the Constitution to come up with a constitutional law answer on the next one, because I've already faced that issue in 27 years of teaching. My students constantly come to me with business questions, which I'm perfectly willing to answer. And then they come up to me with legal questions, and I go, I'm not going there. There's a legal professor down the hall or whatever. And then my other favorite, and I think you'll get a smile out of this one, is I had a student came to me and he said, Professor, I want to learn the truth. And I said to him, I said, this is a business class. If you want to learn the truth, okay, there's a philosophy professor down there, and there's a historian down in the other direction. I said, I deal with business issues. Truth is and it's also a religious professor as well, if you want to go into that kind of truth. So, truth is accurate at the moment because it changes. What was acceptable for business and for the situation changes completely. Even the law changes. I mean, I won't get into the Supreme Court literally changing its mind on things,
Sure.
generations later. So, truth is a whole different issue. But I think that practically we have to consider, what happens when we have no protections from people. Now, I agree with you. There's got to be protections inside the country as well. And we've talked about that. But I think you need protections actually coming into the country, because many of the possibilities, and you mentioned war as an example, I would argue that if we're not at war, we're at Cold War. And I grew up through the Cold War, and we didn't necessarily fire missiles at each other, but there were a lot of things going on, espionage and all kinds of things. And I don't think they've stopped. Okay, I say that sarcastically. And I do think there are people coming into this country, possibly through Mexico, because it's such an open, easy border to get into, but through other methods, okay, who are here to cause a great deal of harm to the country for any number of reasons. And that's why I think, again, I wouldn't stop immigration per se at all. I would vet it properly. I would also agree that the current methodology is terrible. The government is very bad, and that part, you and I can agree totally. The government is very bad at doing things. You mentioned about the
They're very
drugs and
bad at
whatever.
everything they do.
Yes, but unfortunately, it's the least worst of the situation. I mean, I got into a debate with someone who was an anarchist, and his argument was, let's do away with government altogether. I go, well, if you do away with government altogether, you change the entire structure of everything. The government has some basic, and you mentioned the Constitution is a good example. It has some basic responsibilities.
Sure.
If it doesn't meet those responsibilities, we need to change it or fix it. But I'm not in favor of eliminating the government.
Me
There are
neither.
people who are pushing that.
No, but
So
not
I
me.
just want to be clear on that.
No, me
Um,
neither.
but
So
I
I'm
also
sure
don't
the
think it's
audience will
sufficient.
love you, Professor. Where can they find you?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I'm on um, a number of other platforms. You want me to post something for your audience?
Yeah, sure. Post it up there.
Okay. Yeah.
That'd be great.
Currently, as mentioned, I'm a professor at one of the CUNY colleges, and I can be reached there. Um, Actually, if you go on Google and Google me, you'll probably get half a dozen hits as well. By the way, don't believe everything they tell you on Google, because I grew up with the idea that just because it's in a book doesn't mean it's true. It's the same thing, even worse on Google.
That's true. Because when I Googled you, it said very smart, very handsome guy. I mean, Google actually.
That was the only. That did it say that? Okay. Well, actually, the interesting thing is, I have a gentleman with the same name who lives in Texas, who plays music and drums, and I have zero musical ability. So if you ask me to play the drums, you got the wrong guy. So,
all right, Professor, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you
Great
very
discussion,
much.
great time. For now, this is the Rational Egoist. I'm Michael Leibowitz signing out. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Till next time.